Hello, everyone. Welcome to ICAS Expert Voice Initiative Program. My name is Nong Hong. I am the Executive Director of the Institute for China American Studies based here in Washington. The Expert Voice Initiative, in short EVI, is a series of sit-down interview with leading experts. We're going to talk to ICAS audience on the key issues on U.S.-China relations and their impact on many global affairs, which in line with many of ICAS research program, including ocean governance, maritime security, trade, technology, and climate change, among others. Starting in January 2025, we have launched a new EVI series with a focus on the Arctic. So the idea is to host the leading experts from the 5 Arctic littoral states and other non-Arctic states, but important stakeholders, to share the research and also perspective on a wide range of issues on the Arctic. So in following our first and second episode, the Canadian perspective, the Chinese perspective. So today it's my great honor to host our third speaker who's going to share her insights and research from the U.S. perspective. Let me introduce our speaker today is Ms. Marisol. She is a senior Arctic fellow with the Institute of Arctic Studies at the Dartmouth College, and she's also a scientific Arctic scholar at the Polar Institute of Wilson Center and a non-resident research fellow at the Center of Climate Change and Security. Welcome, Marisol.
It's so nice to be here with you. Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you. I'm really looking forward to the conversation. So let's start with the U.S. Arctic strategy. What do you think the overarching goal and priority are to understanding the U.S. Arctic strategy? And do you see any shift or differences in the different administrations?
Yeah, so if you had asked me that question 4 months ago, I would have had a pretty different answer. As many people know, in 2022, the US updated the 10-year national strategy for the Arctic region. And then in 2023, the implementation plan was issued. And there are 4 different pillars to the national strategy. So this is the White House level document that really is supposed to lay out those priorities over the next 10 years. It had previously been updated under the Obama administration in 2014. And so the 4 pillars are security, climate change and environmental protection, sustainable economic development, and then international cooperation and governance. And so those are kind of the broad buckets of interest. I would say the kind of obvious big change from the previous strategy had been this real, the really challenging dynamic with Russia after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and just the way that really disrupted the ability to be engaging with Russia in the Arctic on areas of mutual interest, and particularly around, Arctic Council cooperation. And so that's there was a reaffirmation of the Arctic Council as the premier body for intergovernmental cooperation in the Arctic region. And that's something that I think we'll kind of see how that ranks in terms of the Trump administration's priorities. I haven't heard any language that says that it's not. It's just that the approach towards embracing multilateralism that had previously been more of the approach of the Biden administration. Now it's much more of a kind of transactional approach. Trump has doesn't have an approach that really is about strengthening multilateralism. It's much more kind of based off of it's just more transactional. And so that does affect basically all of those pillars. And obviously, I guess the thing that doesn't change is in the national strategy from 2022, the number 1 pillar is security. Right. And that obviously remains a huge priority for the Trump administration, but their approach towards pursuing a secure Arctic is pretty different from the predecessors. And then, the obvious thing that is going to be really different is the emphasis on climate change. So even more so than in the first Trump administration, we're really seeing his administration now making it clear that they do not want that language, and so that's being removed from a lot of documents. And then in terms of scientific research, just the types of cuts that we're seeing are really affecting a lot of ways, the Arctic, right? So that I would say there's pretty profound um, differences in the approach that will have really immense ripple effects for the Arctic region and beyond.
Yeah, that's a lot of message here, a lot of changes. And the idea, okay, Alaska is the reason that made the U.S. a coastal state of Arctic. So what is there any differences of policy orientation from the federal government and the state government of Alaska?
Yeah, so the Alaska House of Representatives recently passed with very strong support a statement that is really reaffirming the U.S.-Canada relationship and really concerns about the trade war and how that could affect Alaska and the relationship that they have with Canada. And that's obviously not just Alaska. Canada is a very significant trade partner for the United States as a whole. But certainly, even for Alaska, the fact that their House did, pass this statement that's really forefronting that we should have respect for sovereignty and really be doing everything we can to not have an escalatory trade war that could have really, profound impacts, especially if it continues to escalate.
Yeah, that's a lot of message here, a lot of changes. And the idea, okay, Alaska is the reason that made the U.S. a coastal state of Arctic. So what is there any differences of policy orientation from the federal government and the state government of Alaska?
Yeah, so the Alaska House of Representatives recently passed with very strong support a statement that is really reaffirming the U.S.-Canada relationship and really concerns about the trade war and how that could affect Alaska and the relationship that they have with Canada. And that's obviously not just Alaska. Canada is a very significant trade partner for the United States as a whole. But certainly, even for Alaska, the fact that their House did, pass this statement that's really forefronting that we should have respect for sovereignty and really be doing everything we can to not have an escalatory trade war that could have really, profound impacts, especially if it continues to escalate.
Since you mentioned Canada, the next question is how do you see the U.S.-Canada relations? Are there any cooperation in Arctic? Another legal issue, I think the U.S. and Canada they don't have they don't have the same uh, opinion on the legal state of Northwest Passage. My understanding is that there used to be a bilateral agreement between the two states, agree to disagree. I'm just wondering, as you mentioned, there was a tension on deriving from trade. So in the future, do you see the two countries going to carry on this arrangement or it's going to expect any policy or adjustment from Canadian government?
So I would say the security relationship really is front and center because for continental defense, we can't do it without each other, right? There's a reason that NORAD is jointly led by American and Canadian, defense efforts. And so that's just from a matter of practicality that cooperation needs to continue. And in speaking with people who are in the military, they're very focused on the mission, right? So there's a lot of political noise right now and a lot of policies that are advancing that are, of course, having very practical impacts as well. But I would say the security relationship, at the kind of operational level, I'm not hearing of any kinds of issues there. There's just this idea of, we're focused on continental defense and the things that we need to do to be advancing that. And of course, the later statements that have come out from the different candidates that are running for Canada's upcoming election all are reflecting a desire to be increasing defense spending and kind of taking Canada's defense commitments more seriously, which, that is an important thing to be doing. And I think that once we start to see what that actually looks like beyond kind of what's promised, but then what actually happens. I think that's something that is very much needed from a practical security perspective, but also would contribute to kind of having a better relationship in terms of the way that we're carrying our weight in being a part of that mutual defense cooperation. And then, on the economic side, there's so much that's happening in real time, tariffs being promised and then withdrawn and then implemented. The last I'm hearing, this 25% tariffs on automobiles is advancing, which is, of course, is a pretty serious step. And coupled with the language that we're hearing from the Trump administration about this idea about Canada becoming the 51st state, that we are going to be providing such a strong economic coercive approach that Canada would have to capitulate to become a state. That language is really aggressive and really just very counterproductive. The relationship that the United States has with Canada has been an incredibly valuable one, but also a very genuine one. And so it's really like going to your best friend and just punching them in the face for no reason. Of course, there are things that we need to be working through, but this, I think that the way that's being pursued is incredibly harmful, and not to mention that with the USMCA agreement had been negotiated under the last Trump administration. So for him to now say, "Oh, this trade agreement is awful," I think one of the challenges there is that there's a pattern kind of developing where maybe a law or an agreement will be in Trump's favor, and so he likes it. But then if something changes, then maybe it won't be regarded anymore. And so just from a kind of rule of law, norms based system, that I think that creates a lot of uncertainty about how viable any future agreements would be, and at what point that would just be, oh well, this is no good anymore, right?
So right we're talking, I think the U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance is on the way to Greenland today with a pretty high-profile delegation. I know there's some reaction from Greenland, and that remind me of like back in January, Donald Trump Jr., the son of President Trump, also visiting Greenland. That remind me a lot of discussion, as you mentioned. Trump's talking about Canada becoming a state of the U.S. and then also taking over Greenland. I'm wondering, how do you perceive this within, for instance, within Greenland, within the perception from the Greenland people, from Denmark, and also from the international community? If you want to share with us how you feel about that.
What I'm hearing from, or what I'm seeing and hearing about the Greenlandic people's response is that they're very concerned, right? This is a very small country that has been on this gradual path towards becoming independent for the last several decades, and they are aware of the way that they don't have that full capacity to take all of the authorities from Denmark right now and be able to fully execute that on their own, right? Like this is a slow process that's very much about, investing in education to be able to have the expertise to create the workforce, to be really just building up this country. And there is so much, wonderful potential there. But they're very wary of being a small country that gets caught up in this kind of great power, strategic competition, tug of war. Right. And so, especially hearing this kind of repeated language again from President Trump saying, well, we're going to get Greenland some like one way or another. That is an alarming thing for them to hear. And yeah, so I think largely this approach has been also very counterproductive to the goals that Trump is seeking to achieve in Greenland, right? Because if you think about it, it's not that we want Greenland, like the United States is saying, oh, that's what we want. It's about what is the function that Greenland is fulfilling that you are seeking to achieve in an acquisition. And I think that if the administration kept their focus on what it is that they're trying to actually achieve, they would see that there are ways to achieve those economic and security objectives in a way that also continue the really great relationship that the United States has had with Greenland, with Denmark, and the Faroe Islands, of course, the entire kingdom. So I think that this is really a strategic misstep, because if you looked at the ways in which the U.S. could have pursued greater defense or security cooperation or economic engagement with Greenland, back in January, when Trump first took office, before all of this really aggressive rhetoric came out, I think there would have been a much higher level of willingness to be agreeing to some new things. Now they're like, uncertain about, are you guys actually a threat, right? And so that's a very different way of engaging. If they think that the United States is a strong ally and we're in this together, and we're going to be, dealing with the really complicated reality that we're dealing with, but we're going to find a way forward together, that's a very different type of dynamic than, oh, well, if you don't do what I say, maybe we will use military force to get what we want, right? And so if they're having to look over their shoulder, that's a lot of time and energy and effort that could be better spent on all the other things that we need to be dealing with in the Arctic that are very time sensitive, but that are also, resource constricted. So it's really ironically, especially with all the DOGE effort, focused on efficiency, the inefficiencies that have come from the approach that is being taken right now are, on top of, really creating a lot of questions about, is the U.S. a reliable ally, right? I mean, some really profound questions that are being raised. So I would say it's a really complicated situation. And last thing I'll say is that, we also do have existing mechanisms for the United States and Greenland to be pursuing these areas of interest that the Trump administration has. So when it comes to economic development, we have the Joint Committee that has the 4 different pillars of cooperative effort. That's a dedicated forum for the United States officials to meet with the Greenland government, with the Danes, to be discussing the potential and creating new agreements. And that has been progressing in recent time. And then we also have the permanent committee when it comes to defense and security. And historically, the United States did have more people based at Thule Air Base, which is now Patuxent Space Base. So, in terms of if the United States wanted to be increasing the amount of service members that are deployed there, that wasn't something that we were getting any pushback on. We could have brought that up, and they likely would have said, sure. So, to not use the forums that we have for these conversations, again, it's just, it's a really counterproductive approach to actually achieving our interests.
Thank you. So my next question is about, lately, there's a lot of discussion within the administration and different agencies in the States that the U.S. making a strategy push to revive the shipbuilding industry through the Save Our Shipyard Act. And I read a lot of commentary. They are looking at this issue that reflect growing concern. On the one hand, they're concerned over China's spending naval capacity, and there also are concerned on Russia's Arctic defense capability. So, and the need to secure global trade and routes and strategy choke points. So the question is, do you view the Russian and Chinese cooperation in the Arctic as a challenge to the United States' interest in this region?
So in 2024, the Department of Defense updated their Arctic strategy, and that was one of the major differences from the 2019 strategy was the level of cooperation between Russia and China in a military sense in the Arctic, right? So we're seeing more joint military exercises off the coast of Alaska, a greater number of airspace incursions off of Alaska in the ADIZ. So, seeing that as well as, of course, just the ways that China has really been a major enabler of Russia in this, post 2022, Ukraine invasion space where, the United States and Europe and many others were trying to impose costs upon Russia to demonstrate that it's not acceptable to invade a peaceful neighbor. Um, that the way that China has then come in and has really been able to gain a tremendous amount of leverage over Russia because of Russia having fewer partners that they could work with. That's something that is definitely of concern to Department of Defense and to the U.S. government.
Speaking about China, because China is not the coastal state of the Arctic, and its 2018 Arctic Policy White Paper does mention that in order to become observer status in the Arctic Council, China respect all the sovereignty and sovereign right claim of the Arctic states. So I know that there is a lot of discussion about China's expanding activity in this region. Between U.S. and China, and there is a obviously trust deficit. But despite that, do you see any area for cooperation between China and the United States in the Arctic, particularly, for instance, science, technology, etc.?
Yeah, so it's an interesting question. I think we'll have to kind of see how some of these other dynamics play out because there's just so much in flux right now. Of course, there are ways in which the United States and China are signatory to treaties that are in the Arctic, right? And so with something like the Central Arctic Ocean Fisheries Agreement, of course, we have the meetings associated with that and implementing that agreement. And so that is a way that the US and China are cooperating along with all the other signatories. Um, when it comes to, scientific research, I wouldn't expect the US and China to be signing any research agreements or MOUs or anything like that, because there is a concern about dual use data collection, right? And I think that's also something that needs to be better clarified. And I've had some interesting conversations with folks about that topic recently because, essentially all types of data could be dual use. And so I think clarifying what we mean when we say that and what are those areas of cooperation, because really the challenge that we're really existentially grappling with right now is this growing disparity between a much more kind of conventional hard power, these security dynamics that are really tense. At the same time, we have really catastrophic climate change advancing, right? And not just climate change, but the surpassing of multiple planetary boundaries that make the Earth a good place to live as a human. And so ideally, we would be able to work together to facilitate, data sharing and making the best use of the information that we are collecting. Um, but the tension there then is the way that these kind of conventional security dynamics really are polluting that ability to work together on what ultimately really is the ultimate issue of mutual interest. But you just see that from a very practical policy perspective, it becomes really challenging to do that. And so I think when it comes to, what ways, China may be engaging in the Arctic, I think, um, really showing respect for sovereignty, right? Like some of the ways that we've been seeing, Chinese government language kind of challenging the extent of Norway's sovereignty over Svalbard, for instance, that's concerning to see. I think there's a perception that basically China is, it's not about the Arctic in and of itself, it's about how the Arctic fits into China's larger global ambitions. And so the concern is that China is engaging more to be able to shape some of these agreements or some of these entities to be more conducive to their interests. And there's a tension between the way that those interests and the idea that a rising China uh, is not something that China perceives to be conducive to cooperation with the United States. So that's not that there's a tension there. And so that's really what makes this much more complicated.
I think it's been important for China to understand how its engagement in the Arctic is perceived by the coastal state. It's very important. So I would like to move a little bit to the Nordic portion of the Arctic. So how do you define the relationship between United States and other say not only the little state, but including all these Arctic Council states like Iceland, Finland, Sweden, etc. How do you define their relationship? You see more cooperation and then competition. When I say competition, it's very likely we're talking about the ongoing Russian, U.S. and Ukraine negotiation.
Yeah. So again, this is just something that in the last few months has really changed, right? And I think, JD Vance's speech at the Munich Security Conference was really one of those kind of uh, points that we can point to where there's really just this marked departure from the U.S. in the world that we had been used to. Um, really, especially since Truman. And so, it had been the case that, Sweden and Finland joined NATO after Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine because they saw the limits of the ability of other countries to support Ukraine, which was not in NATO, and that was really not acceptable. And so they made that leap. And part of that leap is this assumption that the U.S. is a reliable ally and that the security assurances are there. And now, with some of the changes in the language from the Trump administration and the way that he is advancing his agenda, that is really in question. And so that's a really big change. So obviously Europe now is very much more inward looking, with trying to mobilize their resources to support Ukraine. And recently, when Putin was saying that in order for the ceasefire to go through, the sanctions would have to be lifted in advance. And there was concern about if that was done, that this is like just a complete capitulation to Trump, to Putin, and so he'd be getting really everything that he wanted without giving up anything, essentially. And so Europe, made a very strong statement saying that no, that will not be happening, right? So we're definitely, seeing. I think the European unity is really strengthening in certain ways. Of course, it's a complicated situation, of course, with the rise of the far right in some European countries as well, and the ways that that's affecting the ability to really kind of mobilize around some core issues and have a truly united front. But there is, I think the next few months will be telling, especially with going into the Arctic Council chairship ministerial in May, and the handover from Norway to the Kingdom of Denmark, where Greenland will be leading the next 2 years of the Arctic Council. In terms of the agenda for that, what the joint statement that comes out of the ministerial looks like. All of these will be very telling about the way that kind of below the threshold of the security dialogue, which has really been the focus of the Trump administration so far when it comes to all the other types of cooperation that the Arctic Council focuses on, right? Because that does include any security. What does that look like? That's to be determined. And yeah, so I guess we'll see.
Thank you. Well, speaking about the Arctic Council, United States has served two terms, like back in 1998 to 2000, and then during Obama administrations, I think it's 2015 to 17. Back then, I think U.S. focused a lot on climate change. So as you mentioned earlier, that maybe the current administration is not really a big fan of multilateralism and international institutions. Do you see how the United States will see its role in the Arctic Council?
I guess we'll see what happens. In the first Trump administration, um, that was when Finland was chair of the Arctic Council, and there was an issue at the ministerial with the use of the word climate change, where the United States guidance was that this isn't a term that we want to be included, and with the other Arctic states saying that you can't talk about the Arctic without talking about climate change because the changes that we're seeing are like the reason that we need to be catalyzing the cooperation on these transboundary issues in a transboundary way. And so that was back in 2019. We're now in a very different climate context, right? So the Arctic has been changing so rapidly. We have, warmed even more as a world. We're just seeing more profound implications, not just in the Arctic, but also outside of the Arctic in terms of the ways that Arctic change affects other regions. And so, uh, that I think that's going to be an interesting issue to try to navigate. And I really hope that we're able to find a way to advance that, because it is in the Arctic states have affirmed that the Arctic Council is important. And of course, the change was, of course, with Russian language. That was the Arctic Council had been included in Arctic strategy, and then they took that out kind of in favor of working with so-called friendly countries, or in a more like bilateral way. And then the real change that we've seen then, of course, is Russia trying to then amplify BRICS more in the Arctic. But I would also point out that when the US has had uh, guidance to be, from the administration to be not using climate language, or to be really retreating from the global stage as a leader on climate action, Russia has benefited from that, right? They point to that and they say, oh, this is really concerning. We've been seeing language from the Russian government about, their concern about the Arctic being a peaceful place because of U.S. aggressive rhetoric, or just pointing out the way that Putin and the Kremlin will talk about climate change, it's very much based off of when it is useful to them to acknowledge it, and then when it's just kind of a detail in the background. And but it's, you know, they will kind of exploit different circumstances. And the climate change issue, I think, is one that would be a much more potent uh, area for those who do not wish the U.S. to do well, to be exploiting the very emotional, fraught feelings around this topic right now.
Thank you very much, Marisol. It's very rich discussion. I'm pretty sure our audience is going to benefit a lot to understand so many dimensions of the U.S. strategy and Arctic strategy. So thank you very much for joining me today, and I will look forward to our further connection on this subject. And to our ICAS audience, and stay tuned with this our next episode of this EPI on the Arctic.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.